Thank you, Charlotte. That was great. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? We do have the option to join on Slido to ask any questions. If you want to go onto slido.com, you can put the number 200 382. Okay? Just be up there. Yeah. So, Charlotte, thank you for that. That was excellent to see that in the cinema. I hope you enjoyed watching the film on the big screen. And I just wanted to really talk about the beginning of the process of working with Sheffield DocFest. This is also a co-commission with Sight Gallery as well. And the co-commission really became the table installation that we have at Sight Gallery, plus the workshops that we did. And I just wondered if you could speak to that long process of the commissioning process since we started before COVID-19 in 2019, and how that experience has been for you, and then maybe talking about how the finished project came into being and how that was something that was changed throughout the process of making this work.
Yeah, absolutely. So the commission came about, I guess, formally the commission came about because you had a competition called the Alternate Realities Competition, and I applied for that. But in the long term, it came about, I suppose, on some level because I met your then curator, Joe, who's at the back, on a really crazy trip in Argentina, which brought together a lot of artists and scientists who were, South American and British, and took us to Patagonia to talk about kind of how we could potentially work together. So it was kind of a really crazy situation. And then, so I met Joe there. We kind of talked about the project. I later applied for the commission. And the original plan was to go to Greece and to kind of bring the festival home to its kind of birthplace, and to take a group of, maybe 13 women, trans and non-binary people out to this kind of middle of nowhere, and for us to kind of spend like 2 weeks there living together, kind of communally, and kind of doing all of that. And we were just about to go, and then COVID happened. And we were also just about to go while I was really pregnant. So we were trying to kind of sneak this in while I was about 7 months pregnant. And it was all going to kind of come together in this kind of epic ejaculation of fertility and all of this. And then none of us could travel for about a year. So from that, that was then kind of a process of going, okay, what can we do, and where can we go, and what would be significant? So a lot of the footage that you saw in that was shot in Suffolk. As it transpired days before I gave birth, so I'm quite pleased that I didn't go into labour while I was kind of like knee-deep in a bog, standing there getting really grumpy. So we did that, and then, and then the kind of commission developed, and we talked a lot together, and you and I talked a lot together about how we could kind of present it with the table that's in Sight Gallery. The table got progressively larger and larger and larger as we talked about.
2 metre distancing.
Yeah, 2 metre distancing. We had the protractors out, being like, shit, it needs to be a 6 metre by 6 metre equilateral triangle. And we talked, I think, about how can you represent this kind of really complex process in a way which still kind of allows that complexity to come through and gives people access to that, but equally isn't completely inaccessible. So that installation at Sight, we've got a lot of different elements which are kind of trying to speak to the different parts of the project. So there's a version of this that is probably marginally a bit more accessible. In the tables, there's all of my kind of sketchbooks and paintings about the project. There's all of the scientific ingredients. There's the recipes. And there's the feast kind of set out for you to kind of sit at. And then at the kind of head of that, as you walk in, you have the various versions of female seminal plasma that I've made with different groups of people. And in fact, we added the latest version this morning, which was joyous.
I didn't know that, so that's really exciting.
Sneakily added in there this morning.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, and maybe you could talk, without revealing all the secrets, a little bit about the Thesmophoria that happened in Sheffield. Mm-hmm. As much information as you want to give as possible, but it was a weekend series that started on Friday through to today, to this morning, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that in as much detail as you'd like.
Yeah, so there's an interesting thing there about the documentation, because in the past, I've had, certainly the first group I did it with were really strong on, we don't really want this documented. We want this to be a secret between us. So I talked in the film about how, they just had the audio recorded and they had some Polaroids that they themselves edited through. Second group I did it with, completely the opposite. They were a group of artists and performers. They all brought their cameras out, big HD cameras, night shooting, everybody was kind of documenting this kind of obsessively. And actually, I think this group, interestingly, were quite ambiguous one way or the other and never kind of really came down one side or not. So I should probably be relatively careful because I think we should probably all chat about it and make a final decision quite soon. But yeah, it had all the Thesmophories have a format of you turn up, there's a feast, we chat and make a manifesto. And then we have a day where we start thinking about what we would like our Thesmophoria to be. We make the seminal plasma, so we go through that kind of lab ritual, if you like, and then we make stuff, maybe, if there is making involved in it. And then the final day is this kind of going away. So in our case, we went into the Peak District at dawn this morning. So that might be why I'm not feeling terribly articulate, because I was up at 2:15 this morning. And we went out for the sunrise, which was incredibly, incredibly beautiful. And then we had a walk back into Sheffield, a procession back in. And we consumed a number of magical substances along the way. But I think I should probably keep it on the D-low what those substances actually were.
Great. We'll all be, having a mysterious time thinking about that. I've got a couple of questions from the audience that have just come through. One of the questions from the audience is, you mentioned that in these topics, science is a maybe ahead of art. What did the scientists say to you when you first told them you wanted to make female semen?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I had this idea a really long time ago when I first started making work with stem cells. So stem cells are obviously super exciting because the pluripotent ones can turn into any kind of cell in your body. So have this potential to be anything. So the minute you start working with that kind of material, you obviously go, well, what could I make with this? This is extraordinary. And I thought, maybe about a decade ago, I thought, shit, if I could change the gender of my stem cells, or the sex of my stem cells, presumably I could then make semen. But at the time, the scientists I was working with said, I'm really sorry, but that is actually fundamentally impossible for reasons that we don't quite have time to explain to you right now, Charlotte. But I kept going back to them kind of every couple of years, we kind of have a constant dialogue. And eventually, a couple of years ago, the scientist that I was talking to said, look, it's still impossible, but you should really talk to Professor Lopez, who is in the office opposite me. And so I set up a Zoom with Susanna, and it is, I think, the first time that there has been no element of me kind of trying to persuade someone into doing a project. She was super enthusiastic. In fact, in that very first Zoom, she ended it with just right, so we're going to make your own Jackson Pollocks, was what she said, and was kind of absolutely into it right then and there. And I think that was partly because I just hit her at exactly the right time. So her research, as I kind of touched on, looks at how the sex cells develop in the embryo. And she specifically is really interested in these instances when people develop and grow up with a phenotypical sex that is opposite to their chromosomes. And what that teaches us about is how the chromosomes, or if the chromosomes are involved in the kind of determination of sex. But as I said, she also kind of holds this view that sex can't really be defined. So this is kind of the waters that she's looking at. So when I came to her, it was kind of bang in the middle of what she was doing. So it's just super good timing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I love how you talked about the process in the film, about how this is a kind of ongoing project, not just within the artwork and the documentation and the Thesmophories, but also within the scientific research that's happening. So it feels really poignant and prescient and really, really important work that's happening. And yeah, I think one of the really interesting questions from the audience here is, and something that I've been thinking about, is what's been the most unexpected moment of the project. There's lots of things happen, and it's so varied what has been really unexpected for you? What was not something that you anticipated before the project began?
Probably having a baby in the middle of it, and how that changed the way that I thought about it, I think. I really did find that people will kind of talk about parenting and motherhood. Obviously, it's a life-changing experience. That's a stereotype. But I just wasn't really expecting it to bear down on my work. So, right on the nose.
Yeah.
And maybe I should have done, and maybe that was extremely naive of me not to kind of see that it would, but it really did feel like my own body was almost laughing at me. Like, there was just this point where it's like, I have been like sweating over trying to do this thing, this kind of radical thing, which is, I'd say like non-binary, and then just to have this kind of embodied experience that just seemed to do it so completely and so perfectly, really shocked me. And it really made me rethink what my kind of artistic purposes might be and what the purpose of the project is. So it really, it kind of detoured me a bit. And certainly what my kind of current research is about is this idea of really thinking of the body as something which is constantly changing, something that is really, really transforming all the time, that is never static. And really, really liminal on all scales, right? It's really easy to kind of see that organ transplantation and augmentation, these things make our bodies transitional and changing. But actually on every level, like on a cellular level, on a chemical level, and as I said, on a quantum level, it is constantly in flux. And I think that gives me a lot of hope, because at a time when I think we're all really, really concerned that as humans we cannot change enough to sort our shit out, I think having rethinking the body, having a concept of the body and the human as being something that is fundamentally able to change and does so all the time is really optimistic at a time when we kind of really, really need optimism.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think as well, when you were talking about having your daughter in the film, one of the things that really struck me is this kind of symbiotic relationship between yourself and your daughter during pregnancy and after birth. And I think that speaks to a lot of the collaborative nature of the project as well. And I just wonder how you think this project would exist without the collaborative elements of it. So be that the pregnancy, be that the collaborations with all the different organisations, the Thesmophoria, how would the project look without that collaboration?
It probably looked like some of my work from about 10 years ago. It would be a lot more introspective, I suppose, yeah. And just a lot more limited. I think, there was, I guess, a version of the project when I very first thought about it, where it was all about me making my own sperm. And that is interesting. And I've made a lot of art which is about saying, if I do this thing and I talk about my personal experience of it, then hopefully we can generalize out and say, well, hopefully that will touch people and people will say, well, what would my experience of this thing be? But it's obviously so much more powerful to actually do that thing with other people and to actually put it out there. And also I think it's just so much more relevant to do it collectively. And a bit like what I was saying about art, about thinking about the body as something transitional. A lot of the reading that I've been doing recently as well is about how can we democratize reproductive technologies. And one of the things that we can do to democratize them is to try and make them collective, more collaborative. So it's less an idea of the singular individual and more something that people can do together. So on a very basic level, you might think about how you could raise a child in a community as opposed to just in a nuclear family. But on a scientific level, I just started a project with an Argentinian scientist who I, coming full circle, also met when I was out in Argentina with Joe. And we are trying to make a collaborative placenta. So a placenta that could nurture an embryo, but that was grown from cells from multiple people, including potentially men.
Right.
So that's kind of a literal investigation into, collaborative reproductive technologies. But I think that's something that we're kind of getting to. That I think that might be the next thing that's kind of important for us in, democratizing this kind of arena. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And I think I'm just going to kind of switch slightly topics. I was just thinking about the forms and the ways that you present this artwork. You obviously have this amazing installation, Insight Gallery, which is unfortunately closed now. It was the last day today, but I just really wondering how this is the context of a film festival, and you've seen the film in a cinema today. How does that change your relationship with the artwork and having these multiple forms of it? What does that speak to in your work? And yeah, what has your experience of working with a film festival as an artist been in this commissioning process?
Well, it's been really good. It's been really nice. And it's been really good to think, I think it's been interesting to think about my work a bit more obviously in terms of narrative as well. Like all of my work are these kind of like long projects that go on for years and years and years. And previously I've kind of tried to show that through, like I've documented like all the emails that I've been sent, or have gone back and forward between me and scientists, and I've kind of stuck them on a wall and, you know, highlighted them and kind of tried to take people through. But maybe, you know, thinking about something, actually really taking the whole project and going, how can I tell the story of this project in a way that won't be just completely laughed out of this context, has been really interesting. And also thinking about documentary, like I said, that like that I thought was really fascinating for me, was going, actually, what does it mean to document things? You know, I'm constantly in this process of going, how do I document this? You know, I've got this, you know, probably invisible microscopic thing that I'm working really hard to make. How do I document it? How do I document it? And how those actually the forms of documentation really, really change your experience of the project, obviously. And it's quite liberating to have these multiple forms. And I think it's something that I've only come to as I've got a bit older, because I think it's also about accepting that you've never really finished the project, and that you've never got the one beautiful finished end product. As much as I would love to have the like one beautiful object and this is it and that's the project and this encapsulates it all, I think I've just come to accept that as an artist I'm never going to have that. So embracing the like, you know, here it is a film in a cinema, but here it is an installation, and somewhere else it might be a little film on someone's TV, and somewhere else it, you know, it's the next thing and it's the next thing. And you know, I did an installation recently where the gallery, we flooded the gallery, so the reflections were actually kind of on water. And yeah, I find that actually really liberating, and it's a really lovely thing to be able to do, to go, actually, I kind of let go of this, of having to have one thing that represents this project, and it can change with me as the project changes and as the research kind of goes on.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess to just finish up then, where does the project go next? What have you got planned for in Posse? And I guess you still got the research project that's ongoing, but what are the next steps for in Posse, and where can we see it again?
Well, I would really like to take it to Greece still. So I'm still hanging on to the Grecian fantasy, although the Grecian fantasy now involves a kind of villa where all the dads and our various children hang out, so that we can kind of all go as families. And so that's kind of had to evolve a little bit. But the next actual exhibition of it that's booked in is a really exciting one, is at MIT. So MIT are opening a new wing, a new kind of building, and they've got a bioart exhibition happening in there. Right. So I'm putting it in there. It's quite a small, contained, safe version of it, because they have lots of things in their building that could be eaten by any creepy crawlies or anything, so you have to kind of have everything super sterile. So that's probably the next one, I think, but it's at the moment, I think it's in Mexico as well, which is super exciting. And that's a whole kind of region, Central America, and obviously increasingly South America, that I haven't really touched on before. And that's been very interesting because obviously the context, you know, when we're talking about feminism and patriarchy, you know, doing it in these different contexts is really fascinating, and you have to be really, really mindful about that. Like I was doing like this kind of thing on Zoom about a month ago, and and myself and Susanna were kind of chatting about it, and we were talking about kind of the processes of making the work scientifically, and we had to be reminded by the person who was interviewing that actually, you know, abortion is still incredibly controversial in Mexico. And just that as a context, you know, that completely changes what this work becomes about. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming, and it's been great working with you and working in Site Gallery and the whole context of the project, and just give Charlotte another round of applause. Thanks for having me. Thank you so much. Thanks. That's great.